Say it with me. Divest.
Divest?
Divest from...
Divest.
It's the word that keeps coming up as students across the world, but especially in the United States and increasingly in Canada, as they call on their universities to take a good hard look at their investments and sell off the ones that have ties to Israel and its war in Gaza.
We're interested is a commitment from the University of Toronto to divest from Israeli apartheid.
We're simply demanding divestment, academic boycott, that our administration and our university stops misusing our tuition money.
Just to take our money, our tuition, our taxes away from these companies that are making money off the blood of the people of Gaza.
Now, we should set the record straight. Tuition money doesn't actually fund the war in Gaza. I've read McGill's financial statements and verified with the university itself. Tuition goes right back to university operations. It's not invested on the stock market. But that doesn't change the goal, which is to signal to Israel, we don't want our schools having anything to do with your war. But in almost every case, universities have shut those students down. I'll explain why, but then turn the whole thing on its head and show you why students are so sure they can defy the odds. To divest from something, you have to invest first. And universities invest a lot of money in stocks, bonds, real estate, everything. So here I have the latest financial statements from Columbia, Harvard, Yale, and McGill. I can see Columbia has an endowment, a pool of investments worth nearly $14 billion. Yale, it's more like $40 billion. Harvard, $50 billion. And these endowments are really important. They can be the financial backbone of a university.
A university endowment provides a sort of pool of funds that the university can use to invest. So it's different from getting tuition fees or other sorts of grants. So it provides a pool of capital that gives the university more resilience.
For example, this is where Harvard's money came from last year. The slice of the pie driven by tuition actually accounts for less than a quarter of Harvard's income. The biggest piece of the pie, investment income, mostly returns from the university's endowment. Different universities rely on their endowments to different degrees. McGill, for example, has a very different looking pie. More than half their revenue last year came from grants. Federal grants, provincial grants, American grants, and beyond. Tuition is the second largest slice, and McGill's investment income just over 6%. Point being, even at 6%, endowments are important sources of revenue. They're like giant piggy banks that never run out of money.
And it serves a few different purposes. One could be to provide extra income at a particular moment. Another is to provide kind of backup savings in case things go badly.
And many universities, especially those where students are demonstrating, use these endowments to guarantee long-term financial sustainability.
Sometimes the university might hold assets that produce a stream of income, like you might hold bonds that pay interest payments, or you might just sell some of the investments inside the portfolio.
So this brings us to the first big reason universities keep saying no to students' demands for divestment, and that is it's disruptive to a university's revenue stream, and not necessarily in a small way. So I'll show you something. 2 student groups published a list of several dozen companies that they want McGill University to cut ties with. Companies that are, quote, complicit in the genocide in Palestine. Their words, not mine. On their list, military contractors, weapons manufacturers, fuel providers, all companies that they claim help drive Israel's war effort in Gaza. But many of the other companies on this list are companies like Nestle or L'Oreal or Louis Vuitton that simply do business in Israel. And then there are banks like RBC, TD, Bank of Montreal that invest in or issue loans to Israeli companies. Now, keep in mind, there are a lot of these protests, and different students at different universities are different. They have different ideas, differing demands when it comes to divestment. But in a lot of cases, students are casting a wide net.
There's a real spectrum in terms of what the students are asking. So saying, we don't think that the university should have provide funding to Boeing, for example, because it manufactures weapons. But there are also very, very broad demands that any company or any fund that touches Israel ought to be excluded.
So this raises a few issues. One, Israel is so globally connected that it can be hard to find a prominent company that doesn't do business there.
Some students have targeted an index fund run by BlackRock that includes holdings in Caterpillar because Caterpillar makes bulldozing equipment for the Israeli government.
And how do you actually go about keeping Israel out of your portfolio, even if you wanted to? Most university investments aren't in individual companies. Universities often buy into index funds or hedge funds, where you're not picking individual stocks, you're buying into a pool of investments. It's like a package deal. You could set up a screen to exclude certain types of companies, like weapons manufacturers, for example, but that can increase how much it costs to manage your portfolio. Not to mention, the makeup of these funds is changing all the time as the fund manager buys and sells different holdings.
That index fund fluctuates daily, and the companies that are involved in that index fund change as a company's market cap increases or decreases.
The university may not even know which companies' shares have been bought and sold on any given day. It's all changing in real time. And when a company's shares are bought, what standard are they using to determine whether that company is too aligned with Israel's interests?
It's unclear whether all of those businesses are operating in Israel or contracting subcontractors who are working in Israel. So it becomes very, very difficult on the index fund side of things.
And trying to paint anyone with any connection to Israel with a single brush, that starts to hint at one other reason universities may hesitate to give in to divestment demands.
I think there have already been a number of very high-profile donors that have withdrawn support for universities because they're upset at how the University of Administrations have handled this.
Jewish groups have taken the position that campaigns like this are themselves anti-Semitic.
There were hand-drawn messages and signs plastered to this Starbucks coffee shop with the words, "Stop funding genocide."
Toronto Police's hate crime unit is investigating graffiti outside the Indigo's downtown flagship store. The vandalism targets Jewish Indigo CEO Heather Reisman.
The Anti-Defamation League calls this divestment effort part of a long campaign to delegitimize and isolate Israel, that these attacks punish the entire state, its people, its partners, as if they're all personally responsible for Netanyahu's war against Hamas. A university that gives in to divestment may win praise from protesters, but might also find new anger on the other side of the fence. Plus, if you leave the table, take your money and walk away, how do you affect change?
If as an investor you withdraw your capital, you then don't have the ability to engage, you don't have the ability to push for change, and other capital will come in that either doesn't care about the issue or will sort of actively encourages it.
Even though universities keep saying no to divestment, many have historically said yes.
A lot of these divestment protests for students in America and in Canada and around the world right now are hearkening back to 30 years ago.
UNT, divest now! UNT, divest now!
The university has about $1.4 million invested in 5 companies that do business in South Africa.
In the 1970s, students began pushing for their schools to divest billions of dollars from companies like Ford, GM, IBM, over South Africa's policy of apartheid. Now, it took years, but that effort, involving well over 100 colleges and universities, really isolated the apartheid regime.
It was ultimately very significant, but I think it's worth pointing out that the anti-apartheid movement was really in full swing for about 3 decades. Sentiment really changed during that time.
About a decade later, it was big tobacco in everybody's crosshairs. The impact was symbolic. We're talking millions of dollars in a multi-billion-dollar industry. But the point was, it got done, and by all the same schools we're talking about today: Yale, Harvard, Columbia, Johns Hopkins, Stanford. And less than a decade after that, a similar movement would target Sudan.
Around the world, protesters are trying to draw attention to Darfur. The Save Darfur Coalition at a rally in Washington says it is time for international action.
A group called Investors Against Genocide argued for divestment, especially from oil companies that they accused of helping fund the genocide in Darfur. At least 60 schools pulled their investments out. And this kept happening with different causes. More than 100 schools pulled fossil fuel investments around the early 2010s. Colombia, where the most recent student protests began, was the first school to pull investments from private prisons in 2015. Yale continues to expand its divestment policy on automatic weapons manufacturers even to this day. And let's be clear, in 2024, there are some universities that are at least willing to entertain the idea of divesting from any Israel-connected holdings. Portland State agreed to pause its relationship with Boeing, which we know more for making civilian planes, but they sell military aircraft to Israel as well. Northwestern University and the University of Minnesota struck deals with students to clear camps in exchange for a commitment to discuss the idea of divestment. And Brown University promised to hold a vote on divesting from companies connected to Israel's military. Other universities like Columbia have tried to strike a middle ground, saying, no, we won't divest, but we can make more investments in health and education in Gaza, for example. But then there's the overwhelming majority of schools who've held their ground, refusing to divest. The University of Michigan says divesting would violate a long-standing policy to shield the endowment from political pressures. And look at this map from Newsweek. All those states in red and pink, states which have passed legislation or executive orders making it more difficult, if not illegal, to divest from Israel. One example, in Indiana, state legislation forces mandatory divestment from companies that promote divestment from Israel. So the message there, if you back away from Israel, everybody backs away from you.
I think at the moment it looks very much like an uphill battle to me.
It has a symbolic, a political pressure that comes with it. If the goal of these protesters, the tacit goal, not the explicit goal, is to gain the attention of the Israeli government and put pressure on the United States and Israel to come to a ceasefire and come to a peace, they may be succeeding.
To date, most universities have said no to rewriting their investment portfolios. But students have said, then we're not going anywhere, which brings us to where we are today. Neither side conceding the point, and the protests continue, at least for now.